Hi, Modern World History students. Welcome to Unit number 5, Imperialism. And the basic concept of imperialism is building empires. So, in building empires, what are you doing? You're going out and you're conquering other nations and you are taking their land and you're saying that this land belongs to you now. That's what an empire is. It is a space that you have conquered. It is nations of people whom you have conquered, and now you rule over it. And during the latter half, particularly the last couple decades of the 19th century, that is, the last couple decades of the 1800s, the European nations, particularly the Western European nations, the ones whose economies had become industrial based, the ones who had gone through the industrialization process, the ones who had the access to the new technologies, they sort of attempted to conquer most of the rest of the world. And there's a whole variety of reasons why they tried to do that. And actually, this first section really focuses on what those reasons were. So, section number 1 of Unit 5 is motives of European imperialism. What was it that motivated these advanced Western European states to go out and try to conquer other nations of the world and take their land? So, what I hope is that by the end of this section, you'll be able to explain why industrialized states were determined to acquire raw materials or resources and open new markets by conquering the nations of Africa and Asia. In addition to that, why the leaders of industrialized states felt both compelled and justified to conquer the nations of Africa and Asia. And finally, why industrialized states believed that they could justify conquering the nations of Africa and Asia as a moral obligation. So, going along with this first concept to explain, we'll remind you what mercantilism is. Going along with the second concept, we'll talk about patriotism and jingoism and social Darwinism. Remind you what that is and talk about how that played into this bigger picture of states conquering other states. And then finally, in conjunction with this third concept to explain, we'll talk about paternalism and the poet Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. But first, we're going to talk about what imperialism means and what colonies are. So we're going to start at the top of page 4 of your unit packet. So, as I said, imperialism is all about going out and conquering other nations and ruling over them so that the land where they live becomes part of the land of your own state. You say, this isn't yours anymore. You may have been ruling yourselves for all these generations, but now we've conquered you and we rule over you and we rule over this land. So imperialism really is very simply the process of building empires. It is the process of going out into the world and conquering land and conquering nations and ruling over them. And so, in a way, you might say that imperialism is the opposite of another really important concept that we studied in the 19th century. So can you think of what other concept that would be? So if imperialism means that one nation of people is going to conquer another nation and take their land and rule over them, govern them, imperialism then must be the opposite of what? So take a few seconds and think about that. Well, did you say that imperialism is the opposite of nationalism? That would be correct. I mean, think about it. What is it a nationalist wants? A nationalist wants for his nation or her nation to rule itself, to not be ruled by foreigners, to not be ruled by outsiders. But in imperialism, that's exactly what you're doing. You, as a foreign conqueror, are going and taking over another nation and ruling over them. So imperialism, ruling over other nations, is the opposite of nationalism, wherein each nation wants to rule itself and be self-governing. And wherever there is imperialism, then, you can expect that at some point there will be the emergence of a nationalist resistance to try to overthrow the foreign rulers and once again rule themselves. So the territories that are conquered by imperialist countries become known as colonies. So a colony is a territory that was conquered and ruled over by an imperialist country. This map shows you the colonies that made up the empires of the biggest and strongest European imperialist states during the last part of the 19th century. This is essentially where things stood in the world right on the brink of the First World War. So, I think you already know that the largest empire, this sort of truly global empire, was the one that was ruled by the United Kingdom or Britain. So you see here that on this map, all of the spaces that are filled in with this kind of strange salmon color pink are part of the British Empire. So here's the island of Great Britain itself. There's Ireland. Here is Canada. Canada was not technically part of the British Empire by the start of World War I. It was part of what was called the British Commonwealth. By the time of World War I, the British had officially made Canada and Australia and New Zealand and also South Africa into independent self-governing states, but they were still tied in very closely to Britain through a sort of an alliance called the Commonwealth. So there's Canada, there's New Zealand, there's Australia, here's Malaya, and we see the Indian subcontinent, and then parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and then here's a huge portion of East Africa that was under the control of the British, and even some parts of West Africa. So the British had really the largest of the global empires during the period of imperialism. You can see that the French had a considerable empire. Here is France itself. You see that France ruled most of West Africa, as well as Madagascar and Southeast Asia, what was at that time called Indochina. And then you can see that other European states had empires as well. Portugal had possessions in southern Africa. So did Germany. So did Spain had possessions in West Africa. Belgium had a significant possession in the Congo, in the center of Africa. The Netherlands possessed islands in the Pacific. And even the United States had gotten into the game, conquering Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So you get the idea. In the age of imperialism, who's doing the conquering? What kinds of countries are the ones that are doing the conquering? Take about 5 seconds and think about that. Well, the ones who are doing the conquering, the ones who are building empires, are the advanced, industrialized countries of Western Europe. And you can throw in the United States, because although the United States came late to the game of conquering empire, we did become involved in it. So the countries that are doing the conquering would be the advanced, industrialized Western European countries, plus the United States. In general, where were the nations living who were being conquered? Right? Take a look at the map. The nations who were being conquered, whose territory was becoming incorporated into these European empires, where did they live? Well, you can see that mostly it was Africa, and then Asia, and then the islands of the Pacific. So if we want to get a little bit more specific, the period of imperialism in the last 20 years or so of the 19th century was a period in which the advanced industrialized countries of Western Europe, plus the United States, were going out and conquering nations in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands and making them into colonies, ruling over them and ruling over their territories. That's what the period of imperialism was all about. Which brings us around to that question: what motivated this? What was the driving force behind the desire to go out and conquer so much of the world and rule over so many foreign nations? Well, one motivation was economic. Notice that what I keep saying is that it was the industrialized countries, that were the major imperialist countries, the ones who were going out and conquering other nations and taking their land. And you can imagine that one reason why industrialized countries were doing this was because they required raw materials or resources for their factories. The thing was that as industrialized countries became more and more advanced and more practiced in manufacturing, they became more and more efficient as well. So, as the factories became more efficient and as more and more factories were built, there was the danger that there would not be enough raw materials or resources to provide the building blocks for whatever it was they were making in their factories. Think about the British textile industry, which was the first industry in the world to sort of become sort of machine driven, the first in the world to industrialize. They needed cotton, and they needed lots of it. And remember that cotton couldn't even be grown on the island of Great Britain. And so the British relied on their overseas colonies, parts of this vast colonial empire of theirs, for access to this very important, essential raw material for their textile industry. And as the British textile industry grew, the more cotton they needed. And so the British relied more and more on Egypt, for example, which was a British colony, or India, which was a British colony. And that's actually what you're seeing here. Those are all bales of cotton. All of those are bales of cotton sitting on a wharf, that is a dock, at a port in India, waiting to be loaded onto ships, to be imported to Britain, to be fed through the textile mills in Britain, to be made into cotton cloth, so that the British could sell cotton cloth all around the world. And so that was one major economic motivation for conquering other nations. It was to get access to their raw materials or their resources so that you had adequate raw materials or resources for your industries. So another economic motivation for European imperialism was to gain access to new markets. So remember that your market is the people who buy your product. And if you think about it, your first market, your primary market, are the people who live in your own country, right? So if, for example, the British textile industry is taking cotton from, or is purchasing cotton from Egypt and India, and then processing it into cotton cloth, the first people who you want to sell that cotton cloth to are the British people themselves. After all, you don't pay as much in transportation costs if you're transporting cotton to sell to people who live right there on the island of Britain. And so they're your best market. They're your primary market. The thing was that, again, as more and more Western European countries became better and better, more and more efficient about manufacturing, you got to a point where you were cranking out product so fast and so efficiently that the people who lived in your own country couldn't buy it up fast enough. I mean, there's a point to which you have as much cloth as you need, for example. And of course, as additional Western European countries became industrialized, that meant, for example, when the British, give you an example, when the British first started producing cotton cloth in their factories, they were the only country that was industrialized. And so they could produce cotton cloth much less expensively than anybody else in Europe. And so in places like France and Belgium, Germany, Russia, they were buying British cloth, right? But then as some of those countries became industrialized, they began producing their own cotton cloth and they weren't buying it from the British anymore. And so here's the thing. Consider if you're a British textile industry, who are you going to sell your cloth to? You're producing so much of it so fast that British people can't absorb all of it. They can only buy up so much cloth. And now you're not selling your cloth to people in France or Belgium or Germany or Russia anymore because they're producing their own. So who are you going to sell it to? And so another motive for European imperialism, another motive for going out and conquering other nations, was that then you could make them a sort of a captive market. You could sell your products to them. You could sell your manufactured goods to them. So not only were Europeans looking to conquer other nations and take their land and rule over them to gain access to their raw materials to feed into their industrialized manufacturing factories, right? But also they were looking at those nations as a sort of captive market so that the product that was fed out of their factories would then have someone to buy it. And so in a sense, the European countries that were imperialist countries were practicing mercantilism. If you remember, that was how the British had sort of managed their trade with their colonies really from the very beginning. This is where you purchase inexpensive raw materials or resources from your colonies. You import those into your own country. You you process them into finished goods in your factories, higher value goods, and then you sell those higher value finished goods back to the people who live in your colonies. And in doing so, you make a profit because the value of the raw materials that the people in the colonies are selling to you is lower than the value of the finished manufactured goods that you're selling to them. And so you're gradually pulling wealth out of your colonies and transferring that wealth from them to you. And so the British, as I mentioned, when we gave our little example of that with the wood being imported from the American colonies and being made into furniture, chairs to be sold back to their American colonists, I was giving the example of the colonies that eventually became the United States. But remember what I said? I said that the British did this everywhere they went. All of their colonies were treated this way. The British were looking to suck the wealth out of all of their colonies throughout their global empire. And mercantilism was the process by which they did it. And all the other European countries did the same thing. The British practiced mercantilism, but so did the French, so did the Portuguese, so did the Belgians, so did the Germans, so did the United States. All of those imperializing countries were looking to acquire inexpensive raw materials and resources from their colonies, feed it into their factories, and then take the more valuable finished goods and sell them back to their colonists. So you can understand that a lot of the motivation for imperialism was economic. It was driven by economics. And that helps to understand why all of the countries that were looking to imperialize, all of the countries that were looking to conquer other nations and build empires, were these more advanced, industrialized countries. Now, those same countries had other motivations as well for conquering other nations and ruling over them. And so I'm now moving into this sort of middle column at the bottom of page 4. So there were political motivations. Political motivations. By this time, many of the countries of Europe and the United States had developed a sort of a sense of patriotism about imperialism, about conquering other nations. For many people who lived in these countries, conquering other nations was a sign of your own national greatness. So, for the British, it was a source of enormous pride that so much of the world was under their control. To them, the fact that so much of the map was painted in their color was evidence that they were a great nation. And so that was a source of pride for them. Building empires was a source of pride. And that was true of other nations as well. If you could look at the map and say that in the case of the French, that they had conquered and ruled over essentially all of West Africa, that was a source of pride. It was something they felt patriotic about. They saw that as evidence that they were a great nation. And so patriotism was also a driving force, a political driver. And I say a political driver because in a world where everybody believes that building an empire is a source of is evidence that you're a great nation, then no political leader could sort of afford not to do it. So, for example, if you're the prime minister of Great Britain, or the president of France, or the president of the United States, and the people of your nation, those are all democracies, right? And the people of your nation believe that in order to see evidence that your nation is great, you've got to conquer empires. But if you're the prime minister or the president and you're not going out and conquering empires, then the people of your country may wonder whether you're a good leader, because good leaders would demonstrate their leadership by going out and doing what makes countries great, which is conquering and ruling big empires. And so there was a lot of pressure for political leaders to do that, because building up big empires was considered to be evidence of a nation's greatness. If we're not building up a big empire, then maybe our nation isn't so great, and therefore maybe our leader isn't so great. And so, particularly in democratic countries like Britain, France, the United States, there was a lot of pressure to go out and do this, political pressure. But even if you were a king who was ruling over a kingdom, there was a sense of pressure that you must demonstrate your leadership. Now, you're not going to get voted out of office if you don't, but kings want to be remembered as great leaders too. And so, at a time when greatness as a nation was measured by how much of the world you had conquered and ruled over, if kings wanted to be thought of as great leaders of their nation, they had to follow suit. They had to go out and conquer as well. So political leaders in both democracies and monarchies felt a pressure and a desire to prove their leadership, that they were great leaders of a great nation, by going out and building up empires, by conquering other nations. So patriotism was a sort of a political motivator for conquering other nations and building up empires. At this time, there was another kind of a strange uh, thing going on that was called jingoism. And jingoism is a form of patriotism. And it's a form of patriotism which holds that fighting, that going to war is also evidence. Fighting wars and, of course, winning wars is also evidence of a nation's greatness. In fact, perhaps it's the best way. Fighting wars, winning wars, building empires is the best way to demonstrate national greatness. Um, and it comes from a made-up word. It's a completely made-up word, and you can see that it originated in this goofy little poem in this British sort of propaganda poster. We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do. We've got men and coin and ships and guns to see it through and through and through, right? So jingo itself is this sort of made-up word. By jingo if we do. We've got the stuff to do it. And so jingoism came to mean this idea that the best way to demonstrate national greatness was through fighting. And that, as a matter of fact, nations became greater, stronger through fighting. That fighting was a way to make your nation stronger. It was not just a way to demonstrate how great you were, but it was a way to actually make your nation stronger. And again, there was a lot of pressure on the leaders of countries then to demonstrate their own leadership greatness and the greatness of the nation by fighting, by leading their country in wars. And what's the purpose of wars then? What's to conquer territory? So there was a political motivation going on to demonstrate national greatness and even increase national greatness through fighting and building up empires. The question is, how do you justify all of this? Like, this is starting to sound pretty difficult to justify. I mean, we're gonna go out and we're conquer other nations and rule them so that we can make money off of them and so that we can show off how great we are. I mean, that's today looking back on that, that's pretty outrageous stuff. But don't forget that at that time, one of the most popular ideas in the world was the idea of social Darwinism. Now, remember, when we talked about social Darwinism about a week ago, it was the idea that in an industrial society, some people are sort of more fit and are more likely to succeed in an industrial society, and other people are less fit. They're not as strong, they're not as maybe smart, they don't have the same physical stamina as others. And so some in an industrial urban society will find success and become wealthy. Others, those who are less fit, less well adapted, will not find success and they will become poor and perhaps even die at young ages. So that was the idea of social Darwinism when applied to just like one society of people, the people living in this city or in this country. But very soon, people blew that up to the international level. And they said, well, just as individuals in a society are more or less fit to sort of compete for resources and either live or die, same is true of nations. Social Darwinists began to say, well, in a competitive world where there's this global competition for access to resources and markets, some nations are better adapted to that competition. Some nations are more fit than others to compete. And so some nations are going to become rich. That is to say, they are going to build great empires, right? And profit from them. And some nations are going to be conquered and they're going to become poor and they're going to be under the control of other nations. And so for many people, social Darwinism meant that it was just the natural order of things for certain nations to conquer and rule over others. That there was nothing to be ashamed of in doing this. It was perfectly justifiable for a country that had advanced further in industrialization, for example. It was perfectly justifiable for the British to go out and conquer, say, the nations of Africa, because the nations of Africa had not developed as far as the British had. The nations of Africa were not as far down the road in terms of industrialization as the British were. And so the British, because they had developed these more modern economies, they'd industrialized, they developed new technologies, which allowed them to go out and conquer others. The British had developed adaptations that made them more fit, more suited to compete in this competitive world. The Africans, various nations of Africa, they would say, had not developed those adaptations. And so just as in the world of animals, where the bigger, stronger, faster animals are going to track down and devour and eat the weaker, slower ones, in the world of nations, those who were more advanced were certainly going to conquer and rule over those who were less advanced, less developed. It was just part of the natural order of things, they would say. So with animals in the animal kingdom, so with individuals in human societies, and so with nations competing with each other for resources. For social Darwinists, there was no need to try to justify conquering other nations. It was justified by nature. It was simply the way nature worked. The strong, the more advanced, will conquer and rule over the weak. And I never know quite where to put this, but something that was tied closely in with that mentality was racism, all right? Because very quickly, people wanted to then further justify conquering other nations by looking for some sort of biological or scientific explanation for why some nations were more advanced than others. It wasn't enough to simply, for many Europeans, it was not enough to simply say, well, historical circumstances have allowed the British, the French, the Germans to advance further along the path to industrialization than the nations of Africa, for example, or of India, or of the Pacific Islands. It wasn't enough to say that there were historical circumstances that allowed that. They wanted to look for some sort of scientific explanation, some sort of biological explanation that said, look, it's not just that the people whom we conquer are less advanced than us simply because of history and that eventually they'll catch up to us, and so we should leave them alone. What the Europeans wanted to say is that the nations who we are conquering, not only are they currently less advanced than us, but they always will be. They'll never be able to become as advanced as us because there's something biologically different between them and us, something in our biology that makes us superior human beings to them. That's what the Europeans were looking for. And honest to God, they started to make claims that Europeans, particularly Western Europeans, had larger skulls, that therefore accommodated larger brains, and that this is what explained why why Europeans had further advanced toward industrialization and modern economies than people in places like Africa and India and the Pacific Islands. So look at this, Anglo-Teutonic. So this is a sketch which basically suggests that people from Western Europe have these very tall skulls, which allowed for a larger brain. Meanwhile, this Irishman here, which Ireland is part of Western Europe too, but this is being told from the British perspective. And the British, remember, ruled over the Irish. And how did they justify it? They said, well, look, Irish tend to have flatter skulls, so they have smaller brains. So it's only natural for Britain to rule over Irishmen. And then finally, look at an African, a person from Africa, who at that time would have been referred to as a Negro. Okay, they present him as having the smallest skull of all, and therefore the smallest brain. And honestly, this was something that people in Western Europe and the United States too actually believed in. It couldn't be that the reason why African nations were not as far along in industrialization was that the soil and climate in Africa is much more hostile to agriculture, right? Which it is. The soil and climate in Africa are more hostile. It's more difficult to grow food. It's therefore much more difficult to make the leap from hunting and gathering to farming, which is the essential leap before you can work your way towards civilization and then more advanced developments. No. The Europeans persuaded themselves that people from Africa had literally smaller skulls, smaller brains, and therefore were inferior, biologically inferior, a European would say. 100, even 100 years ago, many Europeans would say that the reason why African nations had not advanced as far in industrialization and in technology as they had was that people from Africa had smaller skulls accommodating smaller brains. And they would say that they were biologically inferior and therefore would never achieve the level of advancement that the European nations had. So this is what we would call hardcore racism. So true racism was a motivating factor in European imperialism. The Europeans felt justified in conquering these nations because they saw these nations as biologically inferior. Now, as I move to the little box on the right side of page 4, the sort of kinder, gentler flip side to that racism led to what was called cultural motivations for imperialism. Now, how can racism like that have a kinder, gentler side? Well, it goes like this. Social Darwinists said, certain people are biologically inferior, therefore they deserve to be conquered and ruled over. So that's the more hard-edged side of racism. The softer, gentler, kinder side of racism is called paternalism. And paternalism comes from the idea, this right here in Latin refers to a father or a parent, okay? So in paternalism, what you're saying is, it starts from the same place as social Darwinism. It starts from the belief that people of these other nations really are biologically inferior. But instead of saying, well, that justifies us conquering them and ruling over them, in paternalism you say, well, because these people are biologically inferior, because these nations are biologically inferior, they need our help. They need our assistance. They need us to come and uplift them, to help them become more advanced, more developed, and honestly, more like us. Europeans and people in the United States viewed people from Africa, India, the Pacific Islands as, yes, biologically inferior, incapable of developing more advanced civilizations on their own. But some people, instead of couching that as a justification for conquering and ruling over them in a sort of a forceful way. They painted it in a more soft, gentle way and say, well, we have an obligation. We have an obligation to conquer them and rule over them and bring them the blessings of our advanced civilization. We must bring them modern technology. We must bring them new economies. We must bring them democracy. We must bring them Christianity. And so this was a little bit different. It was more like, instead of the model of a conqueror ruling over his subjects, it was more like a father or a parent raising his children, or her parents raising their children. That was the model. It still started from the same place. It still started from the belief that these nations were inferior, biologically, culturally inferior, and therefore, needed to be taken care of, helped, raised as a parent raises a child. But that's how they saw it. They saw it as the sort of, and this is the United States here, as the father, sort of the wise father raising children. So the nations of Africa and Asia and the Pacific Islands were viewed as sort of immature, like children who needed to be raised. So again, this starts from the same place, but it's meant to be a little softer in the way it sounds. And it was easier for people from Britain and the United States to sort of take. Like, instead of seeing themselves as these horrible conquerors who were, conquering and ruling over people because they were inferior, it allowed them to say, well, they need our help, and we're helping them. This whole concept was manifested in a poem, one of the most famous poems of all time, by a guy named Rudyard Kipling. Now, Rudyard Kipling was British, and he was actually the son of a British imperial official in India. So you can see what perspective he comes from. And he wrote this poem. He also wrote, if you've ever seen The Jungle Book, the Disney movie, he wrote The Jungle Book. But he wrote this poem called The White Man's Burden. He wrote it in the year 1899. And he wrote it because in the previous year, the United States had defeated Spain in what was called the Spanish-American War. And we had taken from Spain the Philippines, which I kind of showed you on the map earlier. And the United States was in the middle of a debate with what to do with the Philippines. Should we set the Filipinos free to be an independent, self-governing country? Or should we rule the Philippines as a colony of the United States? And Rudyard Kipling wrote this poem as a way to try to persuade the United States that we should hold on to the Philippines and rule over them, make them part of our empire, and rule over them the same way that the British ruled their empire. So the poem goes, we're just going to read maybe the first, well, yeah, we can let's do the first stanza. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. So look at the words that he uses to describe the people of Asia, the Philippines, Africa. He refers to them as fluttered folk. Now, I don't know what that means, but I would say almost like wild animals. And then he uses the word wild. He refers to them as sullen, sort of down in the mouth, kind of unhappy. And most notably, he refers to them as half devil and half child. Part evil, part innocent, like children. Half devil, half child. A very common word that Europeans would have used to describe the people of these nations is savage. Savage, like wild animals, more like wild animals than like humans. And that is how people in Western Europe viewed the people of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Half devil, half child, savage, more like wild animals. Let's read one more stanza. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. So here's another word, heathen. Heathen, slothfulness. Slothfulness, that's laziness. Heathen, that's non-Christian. So this is also part of how the Europeans viewed the nations whom they were conquering, lazy, non-Christian. But then notice how he presents the sort of Europeans in this. Um, you're serving the need of the people who you've conquered, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness. In other words, to work hard for the people who you've conquered. Um, you're filling the mouth of famine. You're giving them food. You're bidding the sickness cease. You're giving them health care. And he's essentially saying, you know, here are people who are savage, who are really more like wild people, more like wild animals. And the job of the Europeans here is to go in and serve them and sort of help them and wait on them and give them food and give them health care and uplift them. It's a burden. He refers to it as the white man's burden. A burden is like a heavy load that you carry. And so he's essentially saying that conquering and ruling over nations and empires is this heavy load that the Europeans have to carry. But they have a moral obligation to do it because the people who they're ruling over need them. They need the Europeans to come in and teach them to be more like them. And notice it says, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. So, in other words, don't be surprised when the people who you've conquered don't appreciate it. They don't appreciate the fact that you are helping them to become more like you, that you're bringing them this more advanced civilization. So, Rudyard Kipling, and there he is. Here's Rudyard Kipling right here. He sees the Europeans as not only superior to the people of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, he sees them as biologically and culturally superior, but he also sees them as having what he calls this sort of moral obligation, this burden to go and help civilize these people. That's paternalism. It's the idea that you are, as the European country, you're more like the father or the mother, the parents who are raising these immature savages and helping them to become more like you and showing them the way. And that you won't be appreciated for it, that they'll fight back against you, they'll resist you, but you have to keep going. Now, this idea, the white man's burden, is then expressed in this political cartoon here. And again, this is strident, vicious racism, but it is part of our history, and you have to be prepared to confront it. So this is Uncle Sam, right? This is the representation of the United States. This is John Bull, who's the representation of Britain, and they're carrying these baskets. This is their burden, and these are the people whom they rule over. And again, the representations of these people are horrible in their racism, but this is the way European and Americans, white European and Americans, viewed the world 120 years ago. And notice that they're hauling these people up over these rocks. And these rocks say things like superstition and ignorance and oppression and barbarism and vice and brutality. And so, these, in the eyes of guys like Rudyard Kipling and the British, these are the rocks over which the British and the Americans and the other Europeans will have to struggle as they haul the people of Asia, the people of Africa, the people of the Pacific Islands toward what we see here, which is civilization. So that, in the eyes of people like Rudyard Kipling, was the burden of Europeans, the white man's burden, to fight through all of these obstacles to bring the people of Asia, Africa, and Europe to civilization. And again, looking back on this now, 120 years later, we go, ugh, what a horrific way of looking at the world. But these ideas were extremely popular 120 years ago, and even, I'd say, even 100 years ago. These were the ideas that motivated imperialism, motivated conquering these nations and ruling over them. These were the ideas that, in their mind, justified, in the mind of the Europeans, justified conquering other nations and ruling over them. Now, the actual business of doing that, that's harder. And we'll get into that in future lessons and talk about how this impacted the lives of people who were conquered. But for now, that's all. Take care of yourselves. I do want to point out one thing. There were some people who saw it differently. Before we go, there were some people who saw it differently. Look at this. This is a political cartoon from around the same time that says the white man's burden, but it puts a little question mark there. And notice here, they've completely reversed the image. Here, it's the maybe a more, what we would say, a more realistic representation in which the people of the so-called savage nations are actually carrying the United States and Britain and Germany and France. That there were some people who recognized that the European countries were taking advantage of the nations whom they conquered, and that this was actually a more accurate representation of the so-called white man's burden. So I don't want to make it seem like everybody in Europe and the United States saw the world this way. Some of them saw it in a different way and perhaps understood better what was really going on in the relationship between the people who were building empires and the nations who were being conquered. So anyway, sorry for having to steer back to that. So again, take care of yourselves, keep yourselves healthy, keep yourselves safe. I'll look forward to teaching you again soon as we continue our unit on imperialism. So long, everyone.